Hello, welcome back to the channel. Like many of you, I was shocked and saddened by the death of Chadwick Boseman at the age of only 43 from colon cancer. A fantastic actor and by all accounts a wonderful human being. I thought I'd pay tribute in our own way by looking at the film that inspired so many people. So today we're going to be looking at the medical science of Black Panther.
Restore the powers of the Black Panther and take you to the ancestral plane.
Let's start with where Black Panther gets his speed and strength from the heart-shaped herb. Now, I'm no expert in botany, but many medications I prescribe every day in the emergency department are originally derived from plants. Things like aspirin, used to treat everything from heart attacks to migraines, is originally derived from willow tree bark. DIGOXIN is a drug from the flower foxgloves, and that's used to treat irregular heartbeats. Morphine and also heroin is derived from poppies, and when thinking of illicit drugs you could probably add in medical cannabis to that list too, but obviously has much more specialist uses outside the emergency department. I think we could assume here that the heart-shaped herb gets its therapeutic action due to the vibranium in the ground that it's absorbing, and probably metabolizes it in some way to make it get into the human cells and give humans their powers. I'm not quite sure how it causes this instant and permanent strength and speed because, you know, we don't have anything like this in reality, but we have plenty of plants here that have these psychoactive molecules that cause hallucinations, most commonly something like DMT. So maybe the heart-shaped herb has a bit of that in it too. And one of the hallucinations here includes a flashback scene of the explosion in the UN building, that scene in Captain America Civil War. I've talked a fair bit about blast injuries in my reaction to the first Iron Man film. You can check that out, subplace here. Next up we have the scene where Killmonger drugs the museum expert.
Hey, time. I think she might not be feeling too good. Hey.
Initially, I thought this would be a drug that just incapacitates someone, but as they then sort of murder all the other museum security, I'm guessing it's probably a lethal poison. So something that's fast acting, only requires a small amount, and something that causes abdominal pain initially. I'd probably guess it's something like cyanide poisoning. She probably just thought the barista here put a shot of almond syrup in her coffee because when something's drugged with cyanide, it can have this bitter almond taste. And you've got to be suspicious when an ambulance arrives this quickly to the scene. In London, the average time for an ambulance is around about 7 minutes. And also what's a bit suspicious is the fact that they start shooting everyone with guns. That would certainly raise my suspicions. The other strange thing here is the sign on the back of the ambulance. The one on the right here is the London Ambulance Service. That totally fits. The one on the left here just stood out as looking wrong to me. This is the Star of Life, so a 6-pointed blue star with the rod of Asclepius in the center, frequently used as a symbol of medical identification. But I don't think I've ever seen it on an emergency ambulance in the UK, but it's used all over the world on ambulances, so probably included here for international audiences to sell the scene.
Let the challenge begin!
On to the ritual combat scene for the throne between T'Challa and M'Baku. We see a few injuries here. Firstly, a penetrating chest trauma. Now, T'Challa is freaking lucky here, probably saved by his ribs. A penetrating chest trauma has a very high mortality, upwards of 60%. We can get punctured lungs, bleeding in and around the lungs, or direct injury to the heart or blood vessels, all of which can be fatal and sometimes very quickly within minutes. M'Baku here does a very cool little capoeira ground move. I like that, used to do a bit of that back in uni days. Then M'Baku gets choked out here by T'Challa in a rear triangle.
Yield! Don't make me kill you! I would rather die!
It's not quite in the right position to get the choke on, so the opponent's shoulder needs to be driven into their neck to be effective. So he possibly taps out too early here, or he taps out because he's in an armbar. But again, this doesn't look quite right either. Anyone that's been in an armbar before will know it bloody hurts. So let's just assume here that he taps out because of the rear triangle. The way this works is by stopping the blood going to your head by compressing the carotid arteries, so the main arteries that supply your brain and the ones you can feel when you feel your pulse in your neck. So this choke is not about stopping you breathing, it's about stopping blood going to your brain, and that's why it works so quickly. By blocking off your carotids, even for a few seconds, will starve your brain of oxygen and make you unconscious. It's extremely dangerous, so please don't try this at home, people. And medically speaking, this is not a choke, it's a strangulation. Choke in medicine is where you have something stuck in your windpipe like food, and so is an airway problem. Strangulation is pressure applied externally to the neck, which is either an airway problem or can be a circulation problem, like this chokehold here blocking the carotids. Next up, this scene, which looks a lot like the casino from the James Bond film Skyfall. T'Challa is set up by Claw, and we have a fantastic fight scene. I think this calls for my patent pending rapid fight scene trauma diagnosis. 3, 2, 1, fight! We start off with a blunt trauma to the neck and mandible, probably no injury. Oh, so a penetrating injury to the dorsum of the foot, maybe an open fracture, so they're going to need admission, imaging, cover with IV antibiotics and referral to the orthopedic surgeons. A wig trauma, the worst kind. Oh, fall from height, could easily have died from a head injury or neck fracture here. You need to be very careful at the scene to immobilize the head and spine. They're going to need a full trauma CT. Traumatic head injuries like this are no joke. Lucky to be alive after a super strength kick to the head. We're talking intracranial bleed on fractures to the facial bones. And what was that, kind of tib-fib fracture? If so, he's going to be in a cast for 6 to 8 weeks. Kick to the back, no doubt a posterior rib fracture, maybe even thoracic vertebral fractures too. Possibly a mandibular fracture or severe concussion, but also a danger of traumatic brain injury. Oh! So, anterior shoulder dislocation and possible fracture to the zygomatic arch.
You look just like your old man.
And finally, a blast injury from a left upper limb mounted vibranium cannon. Weirdly enough, not a lot of experience dealing with this. In this scene, we see Everett Ross sustain a left posterior thorax gunshot wound. And as we talked about in the ritual combat scene earlier, penetrating chest trauma has a high chance of mortality. And I'm guessing here we're seeing a pneumothorax, so a punctured lung, but also probably something called a haemothorax, so bleeding into the lung cavity. And these would be the reason why Everett here is having dyspnea. That's the medical word for difficulty in breathing. There is some first aid given at the scene here in the form of the vibranium beads, the Kimoyo beads. The Kimoyo beads do a pretty good job here of stopping any bleeding externally, but we have a saying in medicine, blood on the floor and for more, meaning you don't just think about the bleeding you can see, but there are also 4 other places that you can bleed internally. One of these places is the thoracic cavity where the lungs are. So these Kimoyo beads would have to be not only stopping the bleeding externally, but stopping it in the thorax to give Everett a chance of surviving. I'm hoping that Kimoyo beads here have a sedating type effect, because his loss of consciousness here is a very worrying sign, a sign that perhaps he's lost so much blood that he's no longer perfusing his brain.
It is his duty to report back to his country. And as king, it is your duty to protect
I'm well aware of my
ours.
duties, General.
And just a thought on this here, they say it's dangerous to take Everett back to Wakanda to treat his medical condition because he might reveal the country's technological secrets. So I'm thinking, why don't they just keep him under a general anaesthetic? I mean, it's not very good for him, but it would solve that problem. On arrival to the Wakanda hospital, a graphic pops up here showing a vertebra, so one of the bones in the spine, glowing red, possibly indicating a fracture. I can't say for sure which vertebra this is, but we have some clues. So our spine has a natural curve to it. So when the spine curves inwards, we call this a lordosis, And when the spine curves outwards, we call this a kyphosis. Given the fact the spine is curving outwards here and the size of the vertebra, we can deduce that we're in the thoracic spine. So the 12 vertebrae that all have a rib coming off them is the thoracic spine. And this fits in with where we saw the entry wound in the posterior thorax. As we said, I think it's damaged the lungs, but maybe not. Perhaps it's injured, possibly fractured, possibly even embedded into one of the thoracic vertebrae at the back.
Let the challenge begin.
On to the epic second ritual combat scene here. Loads going on. Firstly, the abdominal trauma here.
I'll take you both, Uncle James! No!
To die this quickly probably means the penetrating injury took out one of the major blood vessels in the abdomen. So either the descending aorta, the main blood vessel that comes out of the heart, or the inferior vena cava, so the main blood vessel that brings blood from the lower part of the body to the heart. Even if it had missed all the blood vessels, damage to the bowel here could cause overwhelming infection, but obviously nowhere near this quickly. It'd be more hours to days. Amazingly, I've seen penetrating injuries like this before, where every organ was missed, every blood vessel was missed, and all the patient needed was a bit of a clean and a stitch up. Very lucky. Then T'Challa gets thrown into the waterfall. Now, falling from this height clearly has its own problems. Head injury, fractures. It's stating the obvious, but the issue here is if you have a head injury, you get knocked unconscious, you have an extremely high chance of drowning.
Impossible.
T'Challa is found alive but unconscious by M'Baku's tribe.
Why do you have him in the snow?
It is the only thing keeping him from joining the ancestors.
We hear that the cold temperature is keeping him going. This is the concept of therapeutic hypothermia, which is a real thing in medicine but has very limited uses and is very specialist. It kind of fits here, but not entirely. It's probably worth mentioning here that actually one of the major complications of drowning is hypothermia. So in reality, we'd want to warm someone up as much as possible. Therapeutic hypothermia, though, is used in two main ways. Firstly, when someone has had a cardiac arrest, so their heart is actually stopped and we've done CPR and we've managed to bring them back either with a defibrillator or through medications. Even when we do that, the brain has had a reduced blood flow to it for a period of time, so we'll actually show some damage. By cooling the brain in these patients, it slows the brain metabolism, meaning the damaging effects of low oxygen won't be as bad. So this might be the reason why T'Challa is needing therapeutic hypothermia to preserve his brain function. But as we said, this is so specialized that he'd need a lot of monitoring and medical care to ensure this is done correctly and not just kind of dumped in a bath full of ice. And secondly, the principle of hypothermia is used on newborn babies who are at risk of brain injury. I saw this myself when I worked as an obstetric junior doctor, and there's a tie-in here with the channel as the research was funded by Sparks, so the children's research charity that we did a fundraiser for back in the summer. You guys raised over £5,000, so well done you. So I hope you've enjoyed my look at the medical science of Black Panther, a fantastic movie. You can see why Chadwick's performance was such an inspiration to so many. He will be sorely missed. So on that note,
Wakanda forever! Wakanda forever!